Good morning, Richard here, and welcome to today's video. First of all, Happy New Year to everyone. It's the 6th of January here in the UK, and we've been put back into national lockdown, so we are homeschooling Max. So there may not be much of a schedule to these videos, but I will be getting them out as often as I can. I just wanted to share a great trick that I recently learnt. Now, sometimes nailing exposure can be tough, especially if it's likely to be a longer exposure. But today I'm going to show you a super simple calculation that you can use to make your life a whole lot easier. There's no apps, there's no charts, just no websites, just your camera and a teeny tiny piece of brain power. So what if you need to do an exposure that could be, say, 10 minutes long? Well, how do you know it's going to be 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 5 minutes? I took this shot a couple of years ago and I knew that I wanted to get the star trails, but I was totally unprepared. I knew I wanted to get star trails, but I was totally unprepared and I had no idea what shutter speed I would need to get the stars trailing. In fact, I had no idea of any of the settings. This photo is a 10-minute exposure. So, excuse me, how did I get this amateurish shot? I hear you cry. Trial and error? Nope. Live view? Nope. Metering in the camera, exposure meter in the camera? Nope. Guesswork? Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, in this case, that is exactly what I did. I stood there in the freezing cold for 10 minutes, having no idea what it was going to turn out like. And it was freezing, but I refused to do it again. I was too cold. So I lost a better shot possibly, but with a bit of thought, there's an easier way. There's a simple calculation you can use that makes your life a whole lot easier. You simply turn seconds into minutes. Sounds simple? Let me explain. So here is a shot that I am setting up just for this video, but let's assume that you're on location, you're ready to capture that cracker of a shot. You've set the ISO, or you should set the ISO to 100 to keep it clean. Your f-stop or your aperture goes to f9 or whatever your desired one is. Perhaps you've set it to the lens's sweet spot. You then adjust the shutter speed, and your exposure meter tells you that it's going to be longer than the 30 seconds that your camera allows you to do straight away. So what do you do? Well, I'm going to show you a super simple way of finding out the right exposure without trying lots of different ones before you nail it. Now, as with most of my videos, this was done just by me using my Canon, but you can use this on any camera with any camera that's got manual setting, which most cameras have these days, and they'll also have the ability to shoot up to about 30 seconds. But if, like in this example, you know that you're going to need to go longer than 30 seconds, then you will need, bear with me, unprepared, then you will need to set your camera to the bulb setting, and I will come on to that in a moment. Okay, so we know from what we've just looked at that ISO 100 and f9 needs more than a 30-second exposure. But we don't know how much more. 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 minute, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Now here comes the maths and the clever part. I'll do it quickly now. But I will go through this in a bit more detail later on. So set the desired aperture. We're going to leave this at f9. Set the ISO to 6400. That number is really important. ISO 6400. Adjust the shutter speed so that your camera tells you it's correct, and take a test shot. Check as exposed as you want it, or in this instance, adjust the shutter or the aperture slightly if you can. Whichever, if you want to keep the aperture as it is, then you have to adjust the shutter speed to get the right exposure. When you have the final shutter speed, in this case it's 1 second, it's now time to adjust the settings to the correct settings that you want. So change ISO to 100, and we already know that with an ISO of 100, an exposure of 30 seconds is going to be underexposed. So we need to set the camera up to shoot longer than 30 seconds. And now this is where the bulb setting comes in. Now if that's a new term to you, bulb settings mean that you press the shutter button to start the shutter, to open the shutter or start the exposure, and when you release the shutter button, it closes the shutter and ends the exposure. Simple, but there's a couple of caveats to that and things you have to be aware of. But first of all, let's change to bulb mode on the camera, and it's usually found where you'd find the other camera modes like aperture or shutter or manual mode. So just go into there, pick bulb. And the obvious challenge with this is that other than the fact that you may have to keep your finger on the camera for 10 minutes, you're unlikely to be able to keep the camera steady as you press and hold and release that shutter button. So you are going to need to use one of these. Now this is an old, well, this is actually an intervalometer, or you need a remote shutter release. It simply allows you to control the shutter and its timer and a few other things like time-lapse settings, to do time lapses and things like that. It's advisable to have one of these that enables you to lock the shutter up like that does, or a button that allows you to set a timer to start and end the exposure, i.e. open and close the shutter. It means that you can click it up or press the timer, you can leave it, put it down. Anyway, I'll come on to that in a while. It just means that you can press a button and leave it and not worry about it and have the timer do it for you. I'll try and do another video on this at some point in the future. Now really quickly before I go on, I know that you can get apps and websites that can calculate these things for you, but this is just a real quick method using the situation you're in and the time that you're taking the photo. Now in the old days I would have set this one to a minute, taken a shot, adjusted it, taken another shot, blah blah blah, but not in this case. So we've set the camera to bulb, we've set the ISO to 100 because that's the ISO we want. We are going to connect this little device, if it's not wireless, to the camera. Now if you can remember, we had a decent exposure at a shutter speed of 1 second when shooting at ISO 6400. All we need to do is turn the seconds into minutes. So 1 second at 6400 should be 1 minute at 100 ISO. If it was 2 seconds at 6400, it would be 2 minutes at 100 ISO. 5 seconds would be 5. You get the point. There's no, I don't know, yeah. The point is you only have to wait 1, 2 or 5 seconds to test the exposure and not 1, 2 or 5 minutes. Yeah, the ISO for the test shot is going to be wrong, but you're going to correct that before you take the real shot. So you take the shot, you wait 5, 10, 20 minutes, whatever it is you do, brew a cuppa, have a whiskey, do 50 press-ups, whatever it is you do, doesn't matter. But while it's taking that here, let me just explain in a little bit more detail how it works. It's really quite simple. So let's take ISO 100. There are obviously 64 of these in 6400 ISO. There are 60 seconds in a minute. Divide the ISO by 64, i.e. 6400 divided by 64 gives you 100. And you do the same thing with 60 seconds on the minute. So turning the seconds into minutes. Get this right. So 1 second times 60 equals 60 seconds, or 1 minute. 1 second, 1 minute. And here's proof. So you can see that both photos are showing different settings, but they're virtually identically exposed. And to prove this, we're going to go back to manual, take the aperture up to say 14 at 6400 ISO. It's going to let in less light, and I'm going to guess a shutter speed of around 5 seconds. So this may be too overexposed. So let's take the shutter down to 2.5 seconds. Take that shot, and yeah, this looks a lot better. So we know that minutes equals seconds, right? So we know that we're going to need a 2.5 minute exposure because that was 2.5 seconds at 6400. So we're going to switch back to bulb mode. We're going to take the ISO down to 100. We're going to set the 2.5 minute timer on your intervalometer, or you're going to hold down that remote shutter button for 2.5 minutes, and you're going to take the shot. 2.5 minutes later, here are the results. It's the same. I told you it's simple. It's not minutes. ISO 6400 in seconds, ISO 100 in minutes. So what though if you wanted to do it the other way around and knew that you wanted a 10-minute timer or a 10-minute exposure? Can this method help you? Kind of. It's a little bit backwards and a little bit more complicated. So we know that a 10-minute exposure at 100 ISO is a 10-second exposure at 6400 seconds versus minutes. So here you can see that at, move that out of the way, f10 we're well overexposed. So we could change the aperture to f22 to let in less light and therefore reduce the exposure, but you may not want to shoot at f22. You may still want to shoot at f10 still. So the only option now is to prevent too much light is to add an ND filter to the lens. Now you can add an ND filter until you get the correct exposure at 10 seconds at 6400 ISO, and then you can change it to 100 ISO for 10 minutes. And here we are, after a bit of fast forwarding, the lighting, it looks pretty good. Now the change in that gold bottle is me leaving the room and coming back after I had that cup of tea that I was talking about. So let me just quickly recap again to make it a bit clearer. Compose your shot, dial in your ISO to 6400, take a test shot at 6400 until you have the perfect exposure. Once you've got the perfect exposure, you take a note of that exposure length, 1 second say, go back to 100 ISO, however many seconds that exposure was at 6400, you now make it those many minutes at ISO 100. Simple! This is really going to help me out next time I'm out and I want to try and get one of those star trails or smooth, dreamy water shots that you see without spending ages taking test shots and trial and error, blah, 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 blah. I was trying to keep it short. I may have rambled. I'm sorry about that. I'm basically going to leave it there now. Thank you for watching. Please leave me a comment down below if you want to add anything. It would mean a lot to me if you can hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. And I guess the only thing for me to do now is say thank you for watching. It means a lot to me that you'll take the time out of your busy lives to watch my videos, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. So again, Happy New Year, stay safe and see you next time.